Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Heitzen, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started Art of Procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today I'm joined by Ben Evans, President at Auditech Solutions, a company that provides accounts payable and contract compliance audits to help their clients identify if they're overpaying on the invoices for the products and services that they buy. Now, this is Ben's second appearance on Art of Procurement, and I'm really not sure where time goes, but it's been over 3 years since he last joined me in the AOP studio. In today's conversation, we start by discussing the value of inserting audit clauses into your supplier contracts, what they should look like, and how to negotiate them. We then go deeper into compliance audits, where we talk about making contract audits a regular part of a supplier governance program. We go into the nuts and bolts of an audit, the different types of commercial models for hiring an audit firm and for paying them. And finally, what do you do if you identify examples of overpaying? So, without further ado, let's go straight into the conversation. So I know that you're not exactly in procurement, but I'll modify my customary opening question that I usually ask all the guests in Art of Procurement. Did you find your current role, or did it find you?
I think my current role found me. I actually started my career in forensic accounting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a situation where, when two companies are suing each other, they have to hire an expert witness to calculate damages.
Yeah.
I worked at a firm that performed that work. And, through that experience became really interested in investigation and taking on projects that really weren't defined, but
Mm-hmm.
were again investigative in nature. So over time, I ended up joining a company that performed contract compliance auditing for a couple of reasons. One, it was within that same realm of forensic accounting, although not technically forensic accounting. And at the time, it was really beneficial for me to be able to work from home, which I think
Right.
a lot of people, a lot of your listeners are probably doing now.
Yes.
But this was back in 2013, I think. So, wasn't as common as it is now.
It's funny, back then it felt like it was, so I was the same, I was in a role that I took around the same time, probably 2012, maybe even before that, maybe a couple of years before that, that the benefit was working from home and you felt like it was, something really, really special and that you were lucky to take advantage of. And, you would take specific jobs, or at least I took specific jobs because of the benefit of working from home and chose particular career course for that. And here we are now, 10 years later, and working from home is the default.
Yeah, it's crazy because it kind of feels like it was the best kept secret for
Right.
a lot of us in the past, but now everyone is becoming almost a standard or an expectation, and there's a lot of benefits for a lot of people.
So what do you do now today at Auditech Solutions?
Yeah, so I'm the president at Auditech Solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still very heavily involved in the contract compliance practice, but a guy named Ryan Worthen is actually the current head of the contract compliance practice. So I'm involved in everything from responding to RFPs and client issues to um, you know supporting both the contract compliance side, which is probably more relevant to your uh, to your listeners, and the accounts payable auditing side,
Right.
probably a little less interesting.
And so from a day-to-day basis as a company, you're essentially doing auditing to make sure that organizations are paying what they are committed to pay. Is that right? And going deep into invoices as an example to ensure that that's the case.
Exactly, exactly. On the AP side, to put it in a simple terms, on the AP side, the AP audit side, we're looking to make sure that through the processing of invoices, that billing errors aren't occurring. Things
Mm-hmm.
like duplicate invoices, simple pricing errors, credits that are given but not taken. And then on the contract compliance side, we're going a little deeper and looking at whether or not our clients are actually getting the terms that they're negotiating. When
Right.
they have complex terms around rebates, around price changes, around how materials or labor are supposed to be billed, are their suppliers and vendors actually adhering to the terms that were agreed upon?
hmm And as you look at this from a category, like in procurement, we often look at things as a spend category perspective. Are there types of spend that lend themselves more to performing these kind of compliance reviews and audits than others?
There is, and there's no hard and fast rule. I mean, there can always be exceptions to this, but in general, indirect spend is going
hmm
to be the first filter you'd place. So anyone on the indirect side, and obviously that changes depending on what type of company you are. But services, anything related to services, is always a high risk for contract compliance errors.
Okay.
Um, and there are within that range and outside of that range, there are specific categories that are particularly um, complex that generally have non-adherence. Things like fleet. So if
hmm
you have a fleet, facilities services like HVAC, electrical, when there's facilities, construction for a very similar reason. Anything, if you have any of your listeners are in the oil and gas space, anything around the actual setup and drilling in a rig
hmm
is pretty complex. Um, and call centers, I mean, but at the same time, we perform this work for a lot of our clients, and I mean, we're touching heavily into technology on the software side, on the hardware side, and on the technology labor side.
So I want to talk a little bit in the show today around, how do we uncover some of those opportunities, um, and really focusing on the contract itself, and the contract that you have with your providers that enables you to go and do these audits. So basically through audit clauses. Now, really, just from a terminology perspective, I want to start by asking, how are you defining a contract audit clause?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we're referring to, for the purposes of this discussion, a contract audit clause is language that specifically allows a company to audit their suppliers' financial records in
hmm
relation to compliance to billings. You'll also have audit language in some contracts that might have language around how long data should be kept, for example, or what type of security provisions they need to have to be able to continue to be a supplier for the company. But in this case, we're looking to talk about an audit clause that says, hey, you're our supplier, you're a vendor. We're going to have you keep records for a certain period of time, and we have the right to inspect those records to make sure that we're being billed in line with the agreed upon terms.
And how important is it to be specific, that it's for the purposes of reviewing billing records, for example? Because I'm sure that you see a lot of general audit clauses that, may be open to interpretation.
Yeah, I think it's important to be specific for the relationship. I mean,
Mhm.
you can always, if something's general, you can always argue that
Right.
I can do anything I want to do. I think it's important that when you're discussing an audit clause with a potential vendor or supplier, that both parties understand what the provisions in there for and what that will look like if the company decides to exercise those audit rights.
Mhm.
Because even we see instances where an audit clause is clearly placed into the contract. It has very good language and very specific, but it wasn't discussed or really recognized by the supplier or vendor. They weren't aware of what it was. It was just kind of some of that language that gets ignored,
Yeah.
and they were a little bit taken aback at the exercise of the audit clause.
And you talked about timing. Do you recommend like what the data retention is to be able to support a audit? Is it a year, 2 years,
Yeah,
longer than that? What do you like to see?
Generally, I'd say at least 2 years,
Hmm.
but probably if it's a point of discussion, at most three. On these audits, when you perform a contract compliance billing audit, you're generally not going to be looking more than 3 years back, just because of the nature of pulling data that's that
Right.
distant. So I've seen clauses that are 5, 6, 7 years. I don't have the commercial the UCC guidelines in front of me, um, but I think they allow for even longer period of time. But
Hmm.
that's not really a feasible process in a good relationship.
And should you be including anything about the process that you go through, or is that being, you know, where I'm coming from is, how much do you, when you're going through the contract negotiation process, do you want to be tipping off to the other party that, you there's a strong likelihood that you're going to be exercising this clause, because you could leave it in at a relatively high level, yes, have some definition around that it's for billing purposes and record retention, but not really go any deeper. Or I'm sure you can go and say, and if we trigger this, this is the process that we will go through. Should you or would you want to put that level of specificity in a contract clause or not?
I'm a huge fan of transparency. So
Hmm.
whether it's in the contract clause or whether it's just discussed, just the idea that a supplier knows that either there's a high likelihood that they'll be audited, or that there's an audit program going on and that they may be pulled in at any point in time, will create an environment where they're more likely to pay attention to some of the more specific terms that you negotiate
Hmm.
that may not be in their contracts with their other suppliers. Sorry, with their other clients.
And um, when you're negotiating that contract, is there a difference? Like, do you see when you're negotiating and it's on the sell side, the supplier side's paper, that typically these contracts are missed because they don't want to be audited. So it's not even in that standard language, and that you've got to be more vigilant to make sure that it is versus if it's on your paper.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're on the suppliers or vendors paper, they're they're probably going to have no audit clause,
Mm,
or it's going to be very limited in how it can be performed, limited to 1 year, for example. It has to be performed on site, on premise, which is typically a hurdle for many organizations. Um, and so absolutely, I think getting that language in there is important for a number of reasons. Whether you're going to perform a regular supplier audit program within your
mm,
organization, your procurement department, um, ongoing, or whether you just want to have that in there only for instances where it just doesn't seem right. Right? Those are the two big general reasons why an audit's kicked off. One is just a best practice, and they're
mhm,
doing a certain number at any given time, and when one closes, another opens up. The other one is that you're 2 years in the agreement, and I'm sure all of your listeners have had this experience where it just doesn't seem like it's coming across how you expected when you're
yeah.
being billed, and you don't know why. You can't put your finger on it, and it's not necessarily something nefarious, but you'd like to get more insight into that.
And how likely is it if you don't have that clause in the contract that you'll actually be able to perform the audit? Do you usually get some pretty strong pushback if there isn't an audit clause when you try?
Actually, not as bad as you'd think.
Right.
Traditionally, this work is being performed based on the relationship, and that's
Hmm.
really, yeah, the analogy I commonly use is that a contract compliance audit is marriage counseling. It's
Right.
not divorce consulting,
Hmm.
and so now sometimes it is the second, but it shouldn't be. I mean, ideally, you're looking at how can we make this relationship better moving forward. What is not actually occurring the way it's supposed to? Let's address those issues. Let's fix them and remediate them, and then move on with a better relationship moving
Yeah.
forward. And I think a lot of suppliers and vendors will treat it that way if it's communicated in that manner. Yeah.
And as you're thinking of kicking off then an audit on a particular supplier, Are there any kind of best in class ways to communicate that to the provider that that's what you're going to be doing? I think there's probably one way, which is we're sending a form letter. Hey, we're going to invoke
Uh-huh.
this clause, and you're going to help me because it says so in the contract. Versus perhaps more of a relational type approach. But what works best when you're trying to kick off audits with your suppliers?
Yeah, context is important. So
Mm-hmm.
if it's, you want to be honest and straightforward. So if it's being kicked off as part of a larger program, the best way to communicate it is to send that form letter. But prior to that, to have a discussion, generally on the phone, with the
Yeah.
supplier, and just let them know, hey, our company's doing this as a best practice. We don't have any expectation of wrongdoing. There's nothing that has come up that has triggered you being identified as a target for this audit. Really, this audit is a sign that we're a strategic relationship with a
Mm-hmm.
significant amount of volume, and we expect that to be the case moving forward. And so if you're being selected, it's it's not because of anything
Yeah,
nefarious
we
or
don't trust
wrong,
you.
but really because of how important the relationship
Yeah.
is, and because of how strategic it is moving forward.
So what's really involved in the audit then? What kind of information are you looking to get? And is that information that you're typically having to reach out to a supplier to ask for? Or is it information that you're already able to access, through looking in your own invoice history as an example?
So traditionally, most of the information is going to be able to be provided more readily by the supplier.
Hmm.
In some cases, there are company side information sources, like if you're doing a facilities audit, things like Service Channel or Facility Source, that gather a lot of information. Um, but in a traditional situation, one of the first things we ask for from a supplier is just a simple line item billing detail report. And what is that? That's a export out of their accounting system
Hmm.
that essentially has every line item that was ever on an invoice that was billed to your company for the 2 or 3 year period. And that original line item billing detail report allows the auditors, whether internal or an external firm, to be able to really profile where the risk is.
Hmm.
How much spend is in labor, how much spend is in different types of labor, how much spend is in fees, how much spend is in materials, etc. And so that's really where it starts off. Obviously, we gather the contract documents from both the clients and the supplier, and that in conjunction with the line item billing detail report allow us to identify what detailed information on a small sample basis we need from the supplier. So, for example, if you have a provision in the contract that says, this supplier is going to bill cost plus 15%
Hmm.
for any materials that are used either in a construction or a facilities engagement. Well, we would be able to, using the line item billing details, see, well, okay, well, how many materials are being used? Like, how material is this area? Or how significant is this area? And then we would be able to request from the supplier on a very limited sample basis, because we want to be sensitive to their time. So it might be a sample of 30, random instances, and say, hey, we want to see your invoice. We want to see your third party invoice
Hmm.
to see how much this actually cost you. And and in that circumstance, if they're able to provide 30 invoices, and we can look at those and multiply them by 1.15, if that cost plus
Hmm.
15% expectation, then that risk area can get closed, right? If
Yeah.
30 out of 30 of those are good, then we say, hey, we feel pretty confident that that's not an issue,
Yeah.
and
They've got a
then we kind
process
of
to
move on.
manage that.
Exactly, right. And,
Yeah.
and then we move on to the next category. And
Yeah.
so that approach of really using a small sample on the initial risk assessment is greatly appreciated by suppliers.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think all third party firms that do this do that, but I think most are getting to that point. Many suppliers are used to doing these audits,
Right.
but you obviously want to be as sensitive to their time as possible, and not spend time on tasks that don't really make sense and really have any risk related to them.
Do you find that most suppliers have the data that you're asking for relatively readily available? Because you made a comment there about, we don't want to make this overly onerous on their resources to gather all this information. I mean, is it mostly stuff that they can just pull out of systems pretty quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say even going back to like 2013, 2014 till now, um, it's increased greatly as
Hmm.
companies have had higher adoption with technology. And yeah, it's pretty unusual now that they're not gathering and retaining the type of information we have that we're asking for in a very centralized, easy to gather tool.
Yeah. Um, Now you've done the audit and you've brought together all your findings. What's the best way to then present those findings back to the supplier to start the discussion around what are we going to do about it? In a way that doesn't immediately put their guards up because they fear that they're going to get shaken down with some requests.
Yeah, and I think this, if it's been handled correctly, if the engagement has been handled correctly, it's a very collaborative approach
Hmm.
with the supplier, meaning that, I used that example before with the cost plus 15%. If if on two of those 30, it appears as though they build more than cost plus 15%.
Yeah.
If you what the our my view is the best approach is to raise that with the supplier at that point and say, hey, I'm either missing something or this looks to be off. Can you give me some feedback? Can you give me some feedback on what's occurring in this situation?
Hmm.
And in sometimes they will provide, oh, hey, there was actually another piece of material that was included in that material, and therefore it is cost plus 15%. Here's
Yeah.
the invoice. So one, you're able to take potential issues and not wait till the end of the engagement to say, hey, this is a problem, only to find out it's not. Two, you get a higher level of coordination between the audit team, whether internal or external, and the supplier. And I always, when we have our kickoff calls, I would always, with the suppliers, I'm always trying to set the expectation and the hope that, hey, our goal here is that hopefully that we're so coordinated and that there's enough open communication through the course of this engagement that we're going back to our shared client with an audit report that we're aligned on.
Hmm.
It doesn't always happen, but that's always the goal. And I think if you throughout the course of the engagement are very open with the supplier, topics are being vetted back and forth with them, then really nothing's coming out of left field,
Right.
as the saying goes, when that report comes out. Um, if you are at the point where something's coming out of left field, when that report comes out, the we always recommend having that be a call, having that be
Hmm.
a discussion, so that they
Hmm.
understand the context to it. There are instances where there are large issues that are identified that a client isn't going to pursue for financial recovery, but only wants to resolve those things moving forward, but still wants to have it as a finding within the report, right? And so in that circumstance, it's better to have a discussion so that they understand the context to why it's being presented and what the client views in relation to the finding.
Yeah. Now, this may be a basic question, but um, when you are doing these audits, are you solely focusing on the numbers, or are you looking at other things that may have been committed to in a contract to see if they're being performed as well?
So typically we are focused on billings.
Hmm.
Now sometimes, service level agreements will have a financial component to them because there's service level either premiums or credits that are or penalties that are placed when those are or are not met. We do focus a ton on our reporting in process improvement.
Yeah.
So there are instances that there was no overbilling, but there's a process improvement on either the company side or the supplier side to make things work more correctly moving forward. One example of that would be, we had an instance and had multiple instances in the past where on a fleet supplier they have a management program so that when one of the vehicles that is being leased by a company drives through a toll,
Mm-hmm.
$10 a month, and they'll do all the toll processing. But if you don't opt into the toll processing program, it'll charge you $5 a toll. And
Right.
so we've had instances
Yeah.
where a client has racked up $700,000 of toll processing fees on
Yeah.
$50,000 of tolls simply because they didn't opt in to a provision that's in the contract and
Mm-hmm.
was really just an email that could have been sent over, opt me in. And so that's an example where it's not technically an overbilling because the contract was written in such a way where the client had to do it, but there's a process improvement where if the client just makes, and again, that's where that whole marriage counseling comes in, the
Yeah.
client changes their behavior just a little bit, it's going to make a lot more sense for them.
Now, I guess my final question is like I'm a really big believer in with our supplier relationships having ongoing health checks, through the duration of a contract, so that everybody kind of understands where things are. Are we on task? Is the burning platform, does it still exist that we brought you in for? Are we tracking the ROI of the business case and all that kind of stuff? So it has that. It makes sure there's no surprises when all of a sudden everyone looks 4 years later and says, "Well, this contract didn't work and it stopped working 2 years ago, and we want to terminate."
Yep.
The more information that you can get out there, the better. Now, as I apply this thinking to looking at auditing, should we be building this into governance where there's an expectation that at a certain point in the contract, for example, we're going to be undertaking this exercise? Or is that giving too much of a heads up that we're going to be doing it? So, make sure that you hide kind of where all the demons are buried. Like how do you recommend that, you think about doing these in a way that's perhaps consistent, that the supplier isn't then going to come and look and say, well, it's because you don't trust me?
Yeah. The two things that I've typically seen is one, just having an ongoing program. So
Hmm.
a lot of our large clients have, I mean, we have one client that has an ongoing program of about 100 audits they're performing at all times.
Yeah.
And we're not the only firm that's performing work for them, and I think they probably do some stuff internally too. And now in that case, that doesn't guarantee that every supplier gets audited regularly,
Yeah.
but it does guarantee that they're kind of looking and considering which ones make sense at any given point in time.
Hmm.
And it's not about getting selected, as I said earlier, in that environment is not about, hey, we think you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
It absolutely is not. That's one approach. The other approach that we're seeing more frequently, and something I'm actually a huge proponent for, is using the audit as a pre-renewal
Hmm.
decision point on a very significant relationship. So if you have a very significant relationship, you are, looking at, okay, am I going to continue on? Am I, just going to renew the agreement? Am I going to put it out to RFP? Am I going to consider other vendors, or am I just technically checking a box because my organization requires me to? We've had a lot of our clients who start off in that first model, and some of the engagements are right after renewal, and they find things that said, man, I wish I would have known
Yeah.
this before I renewed it. Not even because they want to get rid of the supplier, but because it would have operated differently.
Hmm.
They would have changed what was in the contract. They would have made sure there was some clarification. There were certain areas, one common thing we find is that there's areas that we call either maverick or rogue spend,
Yeah.
which is, it's just an area of spend that's very significant that somehow has no provisions in the contract that govern it. They can really do whatever they want as long as it gets approved through the payable system, right? And so, one thing we've really recommended and seen a lot of our clients doing recently is doing these pre-renewal audits. And sometimes they're on a contingency basis where it's based on recoveries, but often, especially on the renewal ones, it's just on an hourly basis, meaning
Hmm.
that they're not looking to recover any money during that. They're not looking to now, I mean, they might decide to do that once the results come back in some cases, but the real benefit of it is to find out, hey, am I getting what I negotiated? I think
Yeah.
procurement professionals are really good at wanting to negotiate the next thing, get better terms, get better provisions put in the contract from all different types of perspectives. But one thing I think that often gets missed is, am I actually getting what I negotiate,
Hmm.
right? When I kind of hand that over to other parties, and and it just goes and operates, am I actually getting what I negotiate? Because you can negotiate whatever you want moving forward, but if you're not already getting the value you've already generated,
Yeah.
what's the point?
Yeah, and that leads to a gap between what you're reporting, the value that you as a procurement function have driven versus what the CFO is seeing on the P&L, and leads to a lot of mistrust in the quality of the data that procurement is actually providing in their performance when, again, it's not necessarily showing up elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, there's one last question. I know I said one last question, but I had a follow up because it makes total sense to me that you put an audit program in place on a programmatic basis, with whether it's certain types of suppliers or certain types of purchases, and also that you're doing it pre contract renewal or when a contract is expiring. That can probably sound overwhelming for a lot of folks in procurement to the volume that may include. So, I mean, how much work effort do you typically see is involved from the procurement side of things to actually kick off, manage, resolve anything that comes up out of an audit?
It's pretty light.
Yeah.
The gathering of contracts on the client side is something that is normally delegated,
Hmm.
and or is, if there's a good contract management system, takes 15 minutes.
Right.
Um, and then we typically would have the key procurement contact in the initial call, which is a 30-minute call with the supplier, just
Hmm.
to make sure that they're aware that the client's they're aware of the process, and that they're life if the auditors start acting incorrectly, that they have someone that they can reach out to the organization. But aside from that, you're really kind of waiting for the report to come. I mean, you'll get updates, via email, via some sort of update document
Hmm.
on a regular basis, but really aren't being pulled into calls or to do things until you're moving towards resolution. And at that point, some engagements find that things are operating great. So in that case, you get a report at the end of it, and you get kind of that warm feeling that your supplier's following what you negotiated. But when there are issues, you look to get them look to get them resolved quickly, and
Hmm.
it normally can be done in a couple of calls, especially when there's a good relationship, and the findings are clear and well documented.
So it's not so much of a heavy lift, which kind of leads me to another follow up question, and I'll claim that it's a follow up, so I'm not going back in my word of one last question. Um, so you use let's say you have a program in place to manage your audits, and you're working with an outside partner to help execute on that audit and to try and uncover, or not necessarily try and uncover things, but to just look and audit to see if things are what they are or if there are opportunities there. Um, from an audit perspective, like what's the compensation model look like is my first question. And then, well, I have a follow up based on perhaps how you may answer that. So first of all, yeah, if you could talk a
Yeah.
little bit about the compensation model for engaging with an audit firm.
Yeah, well, it depends. So I think it really depends on what your core goal is, right?
Hmm.
So some procurement departments, their goal is to identify, I think you used the term uncover, but caught yourself,
Yeah.
to uncover instances in which they were overbilled and to get that money back within their organization. And in those circumstances, our clients typically do a contingent model,
Yeah.
which is that a percentage of what is actually recovered is paid to the audit firm, and there's zero cost aside
Yeah.
from that.
Yeah.
Meaning that the budget line item for a procurement group in that case is a revenue line item. We
Hmm.
think this much revenue is going to be generated from our contract compliance program. Um, the other type is if the real goal of it is to figure out how to fix things moving forward, and obviously nothing's A or B. It's a spectrum. But
Yeah.
if the core goal is to fix things moving forward, to stop leakage from occurring from the perspective of what you've negotiated, then either an hourly or a per audit fixed price is done.
Hmm.
And so in that circumstance, you still have the same reporting, right? That's coming back, and you will have, hey, in this case, we've identified $400,000 of overbillings, and we've made these process recommendations, and here's where fixes need to be made to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. But the client's not necessarily that interested in pursuing it for financial recovery.
Yeah. So assuming that it's a contingent model, which I know is very attractive to procurement organizations just with the limited budgets that they do have, how are you handling that balance between, obviously the financial incentives of uncovering opportunities and perhaps, as you said there, there may not actually be a desire of the organization to go and execute on those opportunities that have been uncovered?
Yeah, well, so and that does it, so it creates a natural. You'd think that the audit team, because their compensation is contingent, would be, let's throw everything against the wall. Let's be extremely
Hmm.
aggressive in our approach, which may be an initial approach, but the problem with that is you wouldn't last long as an audit firm,
Right.
because you're going to damage relationships.
Yeah.
And so with all of our clients that we're working, well, most of our clients we're working with right now, I'd say 95% of the engagements we're doing right now are in ongoing programs that have been going on for over 2 or 3 years.
Hmm.
Moving one supplier to the next. So there's a heavy incentive for us as an audit firm to make sure that we're only putting forward claims that are accurate,
Yeah.
claims that make sense, and also there are instances where that the claims are technically correct, but they don't make sense to pursue for
Hmm.
other reasons, and that's very, very common, and that's part of our model. I mean, so we have I'd say in most cases, if we go off and we find 4 or 5 areas of overbillings with a supplier, I'd say in most cases two or one, two, or three of those areas are not going to be pursued, even if they are um, accurate technically by the contract, based on something that that is feedback from our contacts either within procurement or the day-to-day business
Hmm.
contact, and that's built into our model, and we work with our clients on those items, and we don't bill for those items,
Right.
so it's just understood that that the business relationship comes first, um, and and that needs to happen. And in some cases, there might be, like I said before, there might be relationships where, hey, no matter what, you could find out that they broke into our offices and stole our computers, and we wouldn't go after them for this
Right.
because of the nature of the relationship. But we do want visibility into it,
Yeah. So we can
and if
address it
that's
in
if
other ways.
That's right, and that's where, if that conversation
Yeah.
happens correctly at the beginning, then you're not performing. That shouldn't be a contingent engagement.
Right.
That should be something that if it's worth doing, either do it internally or pay either an hourly or a fixed fee. So I think having a high alignment, between the audit firm and the company performing the work, makes sure that the case. But if any of your listeners are currently doing this or are interested in doing this, that is something you need to look for in
Hmm.
your audit firm, and that's a question you should ask immediately. What happens in these cases, and really make sure that they're someone that there are a lot of firms that are
Yeah.
like what I'm saying, where
Yeah.
the relationship comes first, and that we will not damage your relationships. Nothing will be communicated to your suppliers or your vendors without you having greenlit it, and and you're comfortable with pursuing it. So that should be something that when you're looking at a firm is a prerequisite, because the relationships are more important than the dollars. They just are, especially for procurement people, right?
Yeah, and that's it's often easy to get to lose sight of that, especially when you have contingent. I always talk about gain sharing contracts. Like when I was a practitioner, I was always wary of them for probably the same reasons. And now I've been on the other side.
Yep.
I've seen that it just truly depends on, how things are framed, the culture of the firm that you're working with, having shared objectives which are relational, versus it all being about the bottom line. And that's something that you can really only truly understand on a partner by partner basis. But that it doesn't mean that gain sharing and contingent is bad. It just means you got to be really careful about how you set that up and what the objectives are and who you're working with to execute it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy. I love working on hourly or a fixed price. I think that's a great place to be as a firm.
Hmm.
We're normally not the ones kind of pushing towards the contingent model.
Yeah.
It's procurement departments looking for, and it's a great thing, right? If and it works well when it works well, right?
Right.
Like when you have a contract compliance audit program within your procurement department, it not only does it not cost you anything, it generates revenue, and it gives you insights into where overbillings are occurring and helps you to close gaps, before they occur in the future. It's a beautiful thing. But yeah, I mean, that's typically the preference. When you kind of get down the road, the preference is normally going to be a contingent model.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think I let my my last question was about a 15-minute question in the end. So I know it's about time to wrap up, Ben. I want to thank you so much for joining us and talking just a little bit more about the audit process and how procurement folks can leverage that to just ensure that that they're getting what they're paying for at the end of the day, and that the contracts are in compliance with their intent. If anybody would like to just learn a little bit more about Auditech Solutions or connect with you personally, where would be the best places for them to find you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and I use it a ton, so that's a great place. And so I'm sure that will be in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
And my email address is ben.evans@auditechsolutions.com. And yeah, I mean, those are probably the two best ways. I'd give out my cell phone number, but I don't know if I'm supposed to do that on a podcast.
You'll end up getting another 50 people trying to sell you auto warranty insurance over the next couple of days if you do, I'm sure.
I think they're already all trying.
Well, Ben, I'm going to include the link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, as you said there. So if anybody would like to connect with you, that will be the best place to find them. And those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. If you go to artofprocurement.com/podcast, you'll see this podcast with Ben and all the others that we publish. Ben, I want to really appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate it.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.